how every hormone is going to have counter-regulatory hormones. In 1921, they discover insulin, and insulin is supposed to inhibit glucagon secretion to long-lasting insulins. When it finally has one on glucagon, it could be 12 hours after you took your injection. What are evolutionary appropriate diets is irrelevant because we're talking about diseases that, set in late in life. When you go back in the history, like I said, when you have 900 pieces of puzzle instead of 50, you can see where mistakes are made.
Welcome to the Melanie Avalon Biohacking Podcast, where we meet the world's top experts to explore the secrets of health, mindset, longevity, and so much more. Are you ready to take charge of your existence and biohack your life? This show is for you. Please keep in mind, we're not dispensing medical advice and are not responsible for any outcomes you may experience from implementing the tactics lying herein. Are you ready? Let's do this. Welcome back to the Melanie Avalon Biohacking Podcast. Oh my goodness, friends, I am so excited about today's episode. It is with one of my favorite guests ever. I just love Gary Taubes. I love the work he's been doing, and he is honestly one of the reasons that I'm doing what I'm doing today. I read Good Calories, Bad Calories, and that started a crazy journey into really having a completely different understanding of the role of carbs and insulin and keto diets and all the things. And that was years and years ago. I've loved all of his books since. And having him on today for Rethinking Diabetes was so special. And we talk about so many things in today's episode. We talk about the incredible nuances and things that so many people don't think about when it comes to type 1 and type 2 diabetes, the role of insulin as a fat storage hormone versus a inhibition of fat releasing hormone, problems with metformin, the role of homeostasis and our evolution for that, fructose and alcohol, the role of judgment calls in science, something a lot of people are intrigued with, which is GLP-1 inhibitors, and so much more. I cannot wait to hear what you guys think. These show notes will have a full transcript as well as links to everything that we talked about. For that, just go to melanieavalon.com/diabetes. There will also be 2 episode giveaways for this episode. One will be in my Facebook group, IF Biohackers, Intermittent Fasting plus Real Foods plus Life. Comment something you learned or something that resonated with you on the pinned post to enter to win something that I love. And then check out my Instagram, find the Friday announcement post, and again, comment there to enter to win something that I love. All right, without further ado, please enjoy this fabulous conversation with Gary Taubes. Hi, friends. Welcome back to the show. I am so incredibly excited about the conversation I am about to have. So, the backstory on today's conversation, I've had this guest on the show once before, which was such a surreal honor, and I can't even believe it's happening again now. It's sort of funny. I was telling this guest this story beforehand, but I recently interviewed a mutual friend, Dave Asprey, and he told me, I don't know how it came up, but it was very random. And in the interview, he said that one of the reasons he's really doing what he's doing today is that the fantastic Gary Taubes introduced him to his book agent. So not the same like glamorous story like that, but I am also doing partly what I'm doing today because of Gary Taubes. I read way back in college, I have it right here, and since this is video, I get to show Good Calories, Bad Calories. Can people see that? And it actually still, I was looking through it. It like, this was old school back before we were doing like audiobooks and Kindle. Like it has like all my highlights still and like all my notes. This book changed my life. I had found the low carb diet and read that book, and the science and the history and just the depth of everything I learned was such a paradigm shift, so mind blowing. Honestly, like I said, it's probably the reason that I became obsessed with the science of diet, if that's a topic. And so since then, I've been following all of his work. He is an acclaimed journalist. I'll put his bio in the show notes. He almost needs no introduction, but he's everywhere and he's written so many books since then. So he wrote, like I said, Good Calories, Bad Calories. He wrote Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It, which was sort of like would you say that was like the Good Calories, Bad Calories for the more general population?
I describe it as the airplane reading version, okay? So it can be read between Atlanta, for instance, and say Salt Lake City, if you were flying out to California and you're a fast reader.
That makes sense. I was actually thinking, because your newest book, Rethinking Diabetes, What Science Reveals About Diet, Insulin, and Successful Treatments, that came out in January of 2024. I was actually reading the Amazon reviews. I don't know if you read Amazon reviews for your books.
I used to. I
stopped that habit. Yeah. Okay. So in any case, I was reading some of them, and what I was thinking was a lot of people were talking about how it was, amazing and very long and intense. And I was like, I wonder if he'll make like how he made Why We Get Fat version of Good Calories, Bad Calories, if he'll make like the version of Rethinking Diabetes for this.
Well, oddly enough, and by the way, Melanie, thank you for having me on the show. The previous book, The Case for Keto, was already kind of the Why We Get Fat for the diabetes book. Although in Case for Keto, I'm talking about obesity and diabetes. But yeah, the Rethinking Diabetes is a return to a very kind of dense, lots of history, lots of philosophy of science, how to do science right. I recognize as I wrote it that I was writing it more for myself than your typical patient with diabetes or just with an interest in nutrition and health.
It's incredible. It is a lot. I learned so much. It really is rethinking. I mean, you really rethink diabetes when you read it. And actually, to that point, because I was going to ask you, what made you decide to write it? And you kind of sort of addressed that. I'm super curious, when you sat down to write it and then you did all the research, you wrote it, at the end, your own paradigm shift or biases or interpretations of everything, did you have any really significant shifts, or did you find what you were looking for?
I mean, the book is full of things that were revelatory to me. So one way I think about this, I now think about it. So imagine like the nutrition disease picture that we're interested in is a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. And physicians at any point in time, the further you go back in time, the more influence they had on everything that comes afterwards, and the fewer pieces they had to draw their conclusions. So like in the 1920s, after the hormone insulin is discovered, and we'll discuss, it's like we have this 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. They have 50 pieces of the puzzle. And they're drawing conclusions about how to treat diabetes, what this disease is, what the mechanisms are involved, and that infect everything we believe ever after from 50 pieces. Now, largely because of the internet and medical publishers and these databases, you can get virtually every article, every textbook from 100 years ago. So you can see, I don't know, I'm guessing 900 of the 1,000 pieces. So you get a much more comprehensive view of what was known and what wasn't known, and you can see what they should have concluded back when they only had 50 pieces. So there are entire aspects of the story that I had no idea about when I started. And some things that I had these sort of vague ideas about, like I had read a little bit about the role of glucagon and this guy Unger's ideas that glucagon dysregulation is more important in diabetes than insulin. And I had developed in doing Good Calories, Bad Calories, a sort of obsessive appreciation for the role of the liver in all these metabolic diseases. But I had no idea that in diabetes research, it starts off in 1921 when insulin's discovered. Everybody thinks this is a insulin deficiency disease, and the organ responsible is the pancreas. And that's kind of true for type 1 diabetes, which is maybe 5% of all cases. But for the other 95%, the liver plays the major role, and that this was worked out by the 1940s and had zero influence on how diabetologists, we'll call them, the researchers who study it and the physicians who treat it, thought about the disease and treated it, even though the physiologists had concluded that the liver was a problem. So they had the wrong organ. And they had the wrong disease for 95% of all cases, and it had effectively zero effect on how they treated it. I never imagined, you're treating, right, when you're giving insulin or pills, oral hypoglycemic agents, you're targeting blood sugar, right? You're trying to lower and control blood sugar. That's why we wear continuous glucose monitors, because we want to see. So I had no idea. Never crossed my mind until the 1960s. No one had ever really measured how blood sugar responds to our foods and our diets, because they couldn't measure blood sugar. They had to take a blood sample and send it off to a laboratory. So you'd get like a patient would come in, you'd take a blood sample, you'd send it off to a lab, and 2 weeks later, you'd tell him what his blood sugar was when he came in to see you. And when he came in to see you, he had changed his diet for 2 or 3 days before because he knew it was a blood test. So they had zero information, feedback on how their therapies were working. And nobody really thought about that at the time. They couldn't measure. They were treating a disease of insulin resistance. There's too much insulin, and they couldn't measure insulin till the 1960s. So it's like, anyway, those are the kind of things when you start realizing that, and you realize how little people really knew, and yet the belief system and the philosophy and the way of thinking about the disease that these people created with such little knowledge and so incorrectly still largely determines how we think about it today. So, long answer to your short question, was there revelations? Yes.
You touched on so many things I want to talk about. And okay, so many questions from what you just said. And I think listeners can understand now why they really need to read this book and have their minds blown about everything. So actually, because you were talking about this a bit throughout that, which is, they were treating the wrong disease in a way, or, seeing it as different things. And so even the word diabetes, like we have type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes. I've even heard there's like type 1.5 and type 3. That word, is it kind of similar to, like the word fat? And we have body fat and dietary fat, but people see them as the same thing, but they have completely different roles. Or like with iron, like we call iron deficiency anemia, and we call iron overload, hemochromatosis, I think. Diabetes, is it even the same thing, like type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes, or is it a completely different disease?
Arguably, they are completely different diseases. And now let me give you, as I tend to do, and I do in this book, the long historical story. Again, diabetes of any kind was an extremely rare disease till late 19th, early 20th century. If you're a physician, a typical physician might see 1 or 2 cases in their lifetime among their patients. And in the 19th century, they recognized already that there were sort of 2 forms of the disease, because there were 2 types of patients. There was young patients who, for whom the disease was sort of an acute disorder and it killed them quickly. And then there were older patients and heavier patients for whom the disease seemed to be more of a chronic disorder and it killed them slowly. But in both cases, the patients would kind of present, aside from the different grouping of the patients, they would present with similar symptoms. Because in type 2 diabetes, like today, we'll diagnose it from a blood test. So you go to the doctor, you get a blood test, they say your hemoglobin A1C is over 7, you have diabetes, or it's over 6, you pre-diabetes, or you're moving toward diabetes. But back then they didn't have blood tests. They didn't have these chemical analyses. So nobody knew they had diabetes until they started manifesting the symptoms, and the symptoms were kind of the same. So you're hungry all the time, called hyperphagia. You're thirsty all the time. You're drinking enormous amounts of fluid. You're peeing all the time. You're losing weight, emaciated, weak. So the patients with both types of diabetes would see the doctors at a stage when their symptoms were very similar. And then they would get one of the ways that doctors would diagnose it, other than the symptom presentation, is they would, again, they didn't have the sophisticated chemical tests. So they would have their assistant taste the urine. That was a diagnostic test pre-20th century. And if it tasted sweet, that would confirm the diagnosis of diabetes. And then the treatment was aimed at what they called desugarizing the urine. So if you could get all sugar out of the urine. And even in the 19th century, they did have chemical tests also to see how much sugar was in the urine. If you can get the urine sugar-free, that was considered successful treatment. They had no idea what was happening with blood sugar. They didn't know that urine sugar is the sugar content of the urine reflects the blood sugar content hours and hours before. They just knew that that was a symptom. If they could make that symptom go away, they had the disease. So 1989 is one of the most famous experiments in diabetes history. A German named Minkowski demonstrates that if he removes the pancreas from a dog and can keep the dog alive, which nobody thought they could do, the dog will develop diabetes. So from 1989, it appeared to be a disease related to pancreas. And then in 1921, this team at the University of Toronto, led by Banting and Best, discover insulin, and they show that it's a very powerful. And they purify it from calf pancreases. So that confirms the idea of Minkowski that this is a pancreatic deficiency disease. And then they show that insulin therapy does like miraculous things with patients, even in the latest, the stages of diabetes where they're basically hours or days away from death. And all of this locks in the idea that this is a pancreatic deficiency, insulin deficiency disease. But it never seems to cross their mind that that's only true for the acute cases, for what we call type 1 today. And then, as I said, as time goes on, they recognize, by the 1940s that the liver is playing the major role in type 2 diabetes. You can't really, if you remove the liver from animals and keep them alive, you can't really give them diabetes. And we could discuss what the role the liver is playing. And the hormone glucagon is playing a critical role by stimulating insulin secretion of glucose by the liver. Then, like I said, by 1961, they finally have a technology available to measure hormones in the bloodstream accurately. And now they can finally measure insulin. They see that type 2 diabetes is a disease of too much insulin, not too little. And if you put it all together, it's the liver and not the pancreas. It's too much insulin rather than too little insulin. It's basically glucagon driving this disorder or driving one of the symptoms, high blood sugar, not insulin. But it doesn't affect how they treat it.
This is so crazy. I remember the first time, I don't know where I heard it, but I read that when people have high blood sugar, that it's primarily actually from the liver, not from, what you just ate. That was such a shock to me. And I was like, how does nobody, even today, nobody really talks about that. I mean, we talk about the role of the liver producing sugar and all of that, but we're always focused on what we're eating more so, I think. And so learning in your book, and you just mentioned both of it now and in the beginning, this idea that you can't even have high blood sugar, so have type 2 diabetes without the role of the liver or glucagon is just mind-blowing to me. And so can you talk a little bit more about glucagon? And because just now you were saying that, the role of glucagon, but you talk about in the book how insulin, or it does affect glucagon, right? It's affecting.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So this was sort of mind-blowing, and I couldn't actually believe I was writing these chapters, because when you go back in the history, like I said, when you have 900 pieces of puzzle instead of 50, you can see where mistakes are made. You can see what people weren't seeing and how they were reacting to what they could see incorrectly. So the first mistake, the whole science of endocrinology of hormones kind of dates to 1869 when a famous French physician says he's purified what would have been testosterone, bull's dog testicles, and he's injected into himself and he's rejuvenated himself with, primitive testosterone therapy. And this is kind of the beginning of the science of endocrinology of hormones and hormone-related disorders. And then there are various discoveries like, that thyroid produces thyroid hormones that seem to have an effect on metabolism. And this pancreas produces insulin that seems to have an effect on glucose, blood sugar levels, and sugar in the urine. And so by the 20th century, the science of endocrinology and hormones is evolving and developing. And there's maybe a dozen physicians in the world, most of them in Germany and Austria, who really understand what this is starting to tell them. But the whole science is based on this idea that there's an organ that secretes a substance that then works elsewhere. So an endocrine disease was considered a disease that was one of the organs is defective. So like the pancreas, diabetes is an endocrine disease because the pancreas is not secreting insulin, or myxedema is a thyroid disease because the thyroid isn't secreting the proper hormone. And so whenever they wrote about this in the endocrinology textbooks would include chapters about how hormones were sort of the crucial element in maintaining, what we call homeostasis. So in maintaining the proper conditions in the internal environment of the body such that our body functions properly. But when they wrote about it, they would write about it from the perspective of, what does the pancreas do? What does the thyroid do? What do the testicles do? What does, the female sex hormones do? And what diseases might be created when these organs are defective. And they had no idea that the dysregulation could happen not just where the hormone is secreted, but it could happen at the receptors or the cells or the tissues where the hormone is received. That's what insulin resistance is, right? It's not a problem with the secretion of insulin. It's the problem of the other cells in the body's sensitivity to insulin. So the entire science of endocrinology, on one hand, you've got these very smart physiologists who are really thinking deeply about this and writing about the complexity of homeostatic systems and the role of hormones and the central nervous system primarily in controlling these systems. And then you've got the medical textbooks that it's all about the hormone and the organ that secretes it and the disease that might be caused by it and nothing else. So one of the ideas here is in endocrinology, the physiologists are writing about is how every hormone is going to have counter-regulatory hormones, counter-regulatory effects. So a hormone that does something on one cell is likely to do something else on another cell as a negative feedback loop to keep it from running out of control, to keep the, equipoise in the system. And just as 1921, they discover insulin. Well, by that time, they've discovered what are called the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans. So they established that insulin is secreted by these beta cells and that it lowers blood sugar. That's one of the more obvious things it does. They also, researchers like a year later, discover the hormone glucagon and establish that it's secreted by the alpha cells of the pancreas that happen to be right next door to the beta cells. And pretty much everything insulin does, glucagon does the opposite. And so when insulin is secreted, it stimulates glucagon. As time goes on and they talk about how these hormones work, and this was fascinating to me because it's kind of the whole beginning of the world of systems biology. So when your blood sugar is going up and it stimulates insulin secretion, and insulin's secreted by the beta cells. So the cells that see the very highest dose of insulin are the alpha cells next door that are secreting glucagon. So they're the first thing to respond. And then the insulin and the glucagon, so the insulin stimulates glucagon secretion to immediately begin to balance out the effect it's going to have. And as the insulin and glucagon go through the portal vein to the liver sees the next highest dose. And of both drugs, and 50%. And the glucagon, by the way, inhibits insulin secretion. So again, you've got all these negative feedback loops being created almost instantaneously in effect to maintain this system in homeostasis and balance. But half of the insulin never gets out of the liver. So half of its action is happening in the liver. And the question is, what's it doing? And the glucagon, it's the organ that sees the second highest dose is the liver. And what the glucagon is doing, insulin is telling the liver cells to take up blood sugar, and glucagon is telling them to secrete blood sugar into the bloodstream. And the blood sugar levels elsewhere in the body are basically determined by this balance. And this is all stuff that's worked out over by the 1970s mostly. And then this fellow Phil Unger at the University of Texas played a major role. The blood sugar elsewhere in the body is the balance of insulin, of the blood sugar taken up by the cells, minus the blood sugar that's secreted back into the cells by glucagon. And insulin is supposed to, I earlier said it stimulates glucagon secretion. I should have said it inhibits glucagon secretion. By inhibiting glucagon secretion, it's supposed to inhibit the secretion of blood sugar from liver cells into the bloodstream. So the idea is you've eaten carbohydrates, your blood sugar goes up. You want to shut off this system for supplying blood sugar to the blood when you haven't eaten any carbohydrates or haven't eaten. But if you're insulin deficient or insulin resistant, that inhibiting of the effect of glucagon fails. So yes, you've got blood sugar going up because you've eaten carbohydrates in your diet and you don't have insulin stimulating your cells to take it up and use it for fuel. But the main reason blood sugar is going up is because the insulin is supposed to inhibit the action of the glucagon, and the glucagon stimulating. Just keep getting this wrong. I need my own AI to keep these things in line for me. Insulin is not inhibiting the action of glucagon. So the glucagon is continuing to tell the liver to secrete glucose into the bloodstream when you don't need it. So the reason your blood sugar is high is, you could argue in part immediately after the meal because of the effect of eating a carbohydrate-rich meal and not having insulin facilitate uptake. But the major reason is because it's not doing the job of inhibiting glucagon, so glucagon is still telling the liver to secrete glucose into the bloodstream even when you don't need it. It's like if you, let me see if I can get a bathtub analysis going. You don't want your bathtub to overflow, and you've got a drain that's taking the water out, and insulin is telling more and more water to go out, and glucagon is telling more and more water to go in. And from the faucet, and the insulin is supposed to stop the glucagon and so in effect turn off the faucet, and it fails to do that. So the major reason why your bathtub overflows is because the faucet is still pouring water into it. And the major reason why you have high blood sugar and diabetes is because your liver is still secreting. It's doing de novo glucogenesis. It's creating sugar and dumping the bloodstream when it's not supposed to. And yeah, I too read about this. I bet you Mike Eads probably wrote about it 20 years ago because Mike sees all this stuff before we do. And the role of glucagon I had read about occasionally. I think Richard Feynman had also written about it. But I didn't take it seriously because the claims were so dramatic. The reason for the high blood sugar and diabetes is not the carbohydrate-rich diet, but the failure of the liver to shut off de novo glucogenesis. And then when I started reading all the literature, you see the hypothesis be raised in the literature, then you see the conflict, lasting 10 or 20 or 30 years, and then you see who wins. And in this case, pretty much everyone agreed that the problem was glucagon and the failure to stop the liver from secreting glucose into the bloodstream, and nobody cared, had no effect. And if you were to go to the NIH website today, it would basically describe the science as it was known in 1925, as though none of this happened.
It's funny. I as well keep getting like confused with it. I think it's so confusing when you're talking about something that is stimulating the inhibition of something, which is stimulating something. It's like a lot of circles to like keep straight. Okay. So basically, let me see if I can say it and let me know if I have this correct. So insulin, I really like that bathtub analogy. So insulin Oh no, I'll start with glucagon. So glucagon stimulates the release of sugar from the liver, so that can create high blood sugar. When insulin's released, it first, before actually anything else, it comes out of the beta cells, and then the neighboring alpha cells that are, controlling glucagon see that or are affected by that. And so then glucagon stops. So now we no longer have that stimulating effect of blood sugar coming from the liver. So we're shutting that off. And then also insulin is sort of affecting the drain. So it's also like putting away the sugar. So it's kind of affecting two different things there.
Yeah, so another misconception is that you need insulin to use blood sugar and for your cells to metabolize blood sugar, and you don't. Insulin, the way, technical term, it facilitates the uptake. It makes it easier. It increases the amount of glucose that they'll burn, but they can do it without insulin. So it's sort of, and again, if you think about it, so you eat carbohydrates and the body kicks in this system to keep blood sugar under control. I mean, it's arguably the major problem because high blood sugar levels are toxic. It's one explanation for all the complications that associate with diabetes, and that were particularly fierce and acute during the years of, prior to insulin therapy, or the first 20 or 30 years when insulin therapy was so poorly understood. So your body's trying to prevent blood sugar from getting too high or too low. One of the points Unger makes when he writes about glucagon is that high blood sugar causes chronic disease and death, but it does it slowly. Low blood sugar could be immediately fatal. So you have also a very powerful system to prevent low blood sugar, and that's what glucagon's doing. So insulin is kind of preventing high blood sugar, and glucagon is preventing low blood sugar by telling the liver, in effect, keep pumping out glucose. But then the other thing that is, we're just talking about the liver. So, there are a few things that were fascinating. A point Unger made, other researchers, clinical investigators had made it earlier, is that, when I said it's insulin secreted by the pancreas, you see a very specific dose response where the alpha cells see the highest dose and the liver sees the next highest dose, and then it gets out to general circulation, but only half of what's secreted get out into general circulation. When you inject insulin and insulin therapy, and it starts in the general circulation, you get an entirely different dose curve. So then you have to give a ton of insulin, particularly if the patient is insulin resistant, to eventually have the same effect in the liver and in the beta and the alpha cells. So now, even if insulin is benign, we can't live without insulin when it's, from the pancreas, but when you're injecting it into your butt or your abdomen or your thighs, and it's percolating through to the circulatory system, all the organs are seeing entirely different. They're seeing non-physiological doses. And because you have to give such high doses to have the proper effect in the liver and at the pancreas, you end up having way too high of doses, unphysiological doses in the circulatory system, where you're manifesting a lot of the chronic complications of the disease. So one of the conclusions I came to, which in some circles in the diabetes physiology communities is well accepted, this is the argument Unger made, which is basically you could never safely give insulin therapy without doing chronic damage and also without causing low blood sugar and having hypoglycemic episodes. And the more insulin you gave, the more likely you'd have hypoglycemic episodes because the insulin stays in the circulation longer, so it inhibits glucagon longer. And you don't get the glucagon protecting you from low blood sugar. So there's all this world of issues come into play when you start accounting for all the wonderful complexity and manifestations. Like the real the reality of these diseases, instead of this sort of cartoon 50 pieces of the 1,000-piece puzzle version that physicians originally learned in the 1920s and never really got themselves away from.
Are you saying that when we put the insulin directly into the bloodstream, it will initially, or it will eventually make its way and affect the alpha cells, but it just requires a lot more because it's not there. It's not originally coming from that location, like right next door?
Yeah, you have to put in a lot more. You have to use a lot more to have that effect. And when you use a lot more, that also stays in the circulation longer. And then again, depending on what kind of insulin you're using, if you're using long-lasting insulins, the half-life of the insulin in the circulatory system will be much longer. So its effect, when it finally has one on glucagon, it could be 12 hours after you took your injection. When long-acting insulin was first invented, this was 1936, 37. For many people, it was seen as a paradigm shift in diabetes therapy, because now you had insulin you could just take once or twice a day, ideally once a day in the morning. And patients would take it in the morning and they'd have, a hypoglycemic episode while they were asleep at night, because now they were hours and hours away from having eaten their last meal, and any carbohydrates or glucose from that meal, and the insulin would still be circulating in the bloodstream, now inhibiting glucagon, when the glucagon should be, causing some secretion of glucose from the liver to, maintain a healthy blood sugar level. But it's true. There are these, negative feedback loops on top of negative feedback loops on top of, with like hormones and counter-regulatory hormones and counter-regulatory hormones. And that's what homeostasis is. It's this incredibly complex system. I think of it as a sort of spider web with thousands of webs. And it keeps this is what Claude Bernard, who sort of invented the concept, said in 1865. Basically, it's all of life is about maintaining the constancy of the internal milieu of the cells. So you're not just keeping the body alive. When you're keeping an organism alive, you have to keep the individual cells alive. The individual cells only see what's immediately outside of their cell membranes and the cells, around them. And then if there might be a nervous system connections to the cells, but they're getting everything they need to live from the milieu directly outside the cells. And so that all of this system, when we talk about a homeostatic system, as Bernard said in 1865, it's designed to keep that milieu relatively constant. It's like our cells are, they're naked people walking around outside, and they're going to stay alive. And healthy. They better live like in Oakland, where I am, where it's 65 degrees and sunny all year round. Because if it diverges from being 65 and sunny, they might die from cold exposure or heat exposure, or, whatever. So that's the whole system is designed to keep that internal milieu constant, relatively constant. You perturb it. The way you prevent it from being seriously perturbed is all these negative feedback. So a hormone that does one thing also kicks into action a hormone that does the opposite. And the hormone that does the opposite in turn triggers that first hormone.
To that point, what are your thoughts on the role of time with the homeostasis? And what I mean by that is, because you were just talking about how with hypoglycemia, there's all these different potential hormones involved to prevent us from getting that. But with hyperglycemia, it's really just insulin, and the effects from that it's like negative health effects down the line in the future. So it seems like the body, is really intensely, acutely aware of the present moment and maintaining homeostasis, but does it have a perspective of the long term? Because you would think in a way it doesn't, because it doesn't seem to, quote, care as much about hyperglycemia. But at the same time, we, seem to store a lot of fat to prevent from future starvation, which that would be a long-term homeostatic thing. Yeah. What are your thoughts on the perspective?
Okay. So we're going to have to get back to the fat and protecting from starvation. But yeah, the body knows. And again, this is as a system, as the science progressed, 1920s onwards. I described sort of how the primitive state of the science in 1921 when insulin discovered, and then like glucagon is discovered, I think the year after, and the growth hormone is discovered around 1922. So they have all these ideas basically about diseases of too much or too little hormone because they can sort of see the effect, too much testosterone or too little, too much growth hormone or too little. With growth hormone, if you have a tumor in the hypothalamus, not the hypothalamus, a pituitary gland of a giant, then you can guess that the pituitary gland is secreting something that's caused the giant to grow too much. Or the individual to grow into someone who's like 7 or 8 feet tall. By the 1960s, once they have a technology to measure insulin levels, they can now start, and other hormones, they can now start establishing that, for instance, with insulin, the observation was that patients with type 2 diabetes both have high blood sugar and a lot of insulin in their circulation. So they must not be, somehow the insulin must not be working properly. And it takes a long time to establish what that is. Is it the insulin that's not working properly? Is it the cells that are responding to the insulin that are not working properly? Like what exactly is insulin therapy? Insulin resistance, So that takes about a decade just to figure that out. When they have insulin available, this also happens, this is the late 1950s. For the first time ever, they have available methods, reliable methods to measure fatty acids in the circulation. And one of the observations was that if you add insulin to, fat cells in a petri dish in a medium, and you add insulin, and the fat cells will take up the fatty acids in the medium. And if you add adrenaline, they will release the fatty acids. And you can do this in, or live mice or humans too. Give them adrenaline and take a blood sample, and you'll see that fatty acid levels go up. And the way this was interpreted is that, adrenaline is a flight-fight response. So you're presented with a threat, and you start to secrete insulin, and the insulin tells the fat tissue to dump basically stored fat into the circulation, because if you have to either fight or flee, you're going to need a lot of fuel. And you don't want to run out of fuel midway, like 30 yards into your sprint away from the lion, because then, those people who didn't have any survival advantage, and their children, they didn't have children. So the realization was that the hormones are not just there to supply the immediate needs of the body, they're there to supply the anticipatory needs of the body. And that includes seasonal needs, for instance, as the seasons change, or if you get pregnant and, your body has to know that there's going to be 2 people to feed, not just one. The awareness was that the system actually has evolved to take into account the future as well as the present. And you're always balancing the future versus the present. So when you're trying to maximize both the function of the body in the present, and then, you're maximizing or minimizing the likelihood that you won't have the resources necessary in the future to deal with the vicissitudes of the environment. Part of the thinking here was that the role of the hypothalamus in all this is that it takes the signals from the environment, from what's happening. Do I see prey? Do I see a mate, a potential mate? Is it getting cold out? Are the days getting shorter? And does that mean winter's coming? and then translates those through hormonal and nervous system signals into whatever's necessary, whatever functions are necessary to, for instance, store fuel for winter, or make fuel available to the cells like adrenaline does to flee, or pump up sex hormone for the mate, whatever it is. But that's the role that the brain is playing, and all that is taking the observations from the environment and through the central nervous system and through, hormones, endocrine glands in the brain and the brainstem, getting it to prepare for the future, for what's happening outside. It's really cool stuff, and it's so absent in any thinking about these disorders. Oh, let me backtrack, by the way, the fat storage for future famines, sort of preparing, for, the idea is, and again, this was worked out beginning in the 1930s to the 1960s, and then in a field of research known as physiological psychology, as opposed to obesity research. But fat storage is being determined by the central nervous system primarily, and insulin, and the hormone insulin. And when you consume a meal, you sort of set into play this stimulation of hormones that determine what you'll do with the calories you're consuming. So, for instance, it'll prioritize using carbohydrates for fuel because you have no meaningful storage for carbohydrates. And high blood sugar is high. So if you're eating carbohydrates, you'll stimulate insulin secretion, which will tell the blood, will facilitate uptake of glucose and keep blood sugar stable. And it'll convert some of the glucose into fat for storage. And it also tells the fat cells to store fat, because you want to burn the glucose. You don't want to burn the fat at the moment because you have plenty of storage for fat. But you'll need the fat for the intermeal intervals. This isn't just if you go 2 weeks without a meal, you better be able to tap into your fat supplies, or 3 days. It's in between meals. If you're eating a mixed meal, your blood sugar will go up and your insulin will facilitate use of blood sugar for fuel. But as blood sugar comes down, then the way the body's supposed to work, right, is fat cells see this negative signal of insulin deficiency, and they start releasing fatty acids into the bloodstream, and your lean tissue and your liver the organs start using that fat for fuel. So it's a short term, it's like a wallet more than a bank account. You go to the ATM, you take some money out, you put it in your wallet, you walk around every time this is, pre-Apple Pay. You take money out of your wallet and use it to buy meals, and depending on how much you took out to begin with and how spendthrift you are, at the end of the day or the end of the week, you got to go back to the ATM and refill the wallet. And so the fat tissue is kind of like the wallet, and the insulin keeps the wallet in your pocket, basically. So you have to wait for insulin to come down before you can use it.
What is the significance? Because you talk in the book about how they discovered, and I think it's when they were tagging the different fatty acids, maybe with deuterium. I don't know if that was the same tagging situation, analyzing, but this idea that it's largely passive, the fat moving in and out of the cells.
It's not so much passive, but it's that it's not necessarily associated with what we're eating or how much we're eating. So, and again, this is a story I tell a little bit in every book, and I'm going to tell more at last. I hope will be my last nutrition.
Your last? Have you hit nutrition book fatigue, or does it feel complete?
On some level, well, first of all, we've kind of created a revolution. So, before I came along, there were, half a dozen diet books talking about the benefits of low-carb diets and keto, like Atkins, and the Eads with Protein Power and Sugar Busters, and The Zone, a little bit crazy as that book was. And then, my role was to kind of look at all the science and place these books in the context of this greater scientific picture that as far as I could tell, having started off without any bias, completely sort of supported the notion that the carbohydrates are the problem in the modern diets. And then once my book came out, that the world started to explode. It might have started to explode before then. Maybe my book was riding a wave rather than causing the wave. It's hard to tell. Now there are dozens and dozens, hundreds of books and keto cookbooks and low carb cookbooks and websites and apps, and it's sort of, the field is saturated. So the only things I really want to write about are, I want to have the confidence that whatever I'm writing is very probably right. And I want it to be, different. I don't want to write what everyone else is writing, and we're running out of anything new to say. And one of the manifestations of that is you see people like, first of all, you have people advocate for low carb diets, but have to figure out a new way to present them. So they're high protein diets, or they're low, linoleic acid diets, or they're high satiety diets, or anything. If you don't have to say what's now become sort of the bedrock approach to successful weight loss and remission of many chronic diseases. And then the other, it's just a lot of very smart people out there doing this. I have, my approach as a journalist, and having become a medical historian, at least so far, I seem to be better at this than anybody else I've read, except maybe my colleague, Nina Teicholz.
I had her recently on the show.
It's no fun to write a book that everyone else has written. And then, as I say in the diabetes book, I kind of keep unpacking what were chapters in my previous book. So I wrote The Case Against Sugar, was a sort of book-length unpacking of the science and history of the, 30 or 40 pages I had on sugar in Good Calories, Bad Calories. Why we get fat, focused on the obesity story and the dietary implications. And The Case for Keto focused on the dietary implications primarily. And Keto story was kind of a flip side of the same book, but they were different ways to approach this. And at this point now, I also want to help, people afflicted with these disorders who want to try and fix them through diet to think about it the way I correctly. And I've been thinking about this as long and as deeply as anyone around. So I think I have something to add. The diabetes book just was one of these books that had to be read. This history had never been covered. There was one quite good history of diabetes disease by a British diabetes specialist named Robert Tattersall, and I wish he had still been alive, or I would have loved to interview him for this book. And he did a pretty good job. He never touched diet disease, barely touched that story. And so I felt that had to be written. And the last book, there might be 2 more books, but it's really getting, it's not a lot more blood that could come from this stone. Although the last book is also one that has to be written. So
I've got one for you that you could write.
Okay, what's that?
You talk, I'm joking, but you talk in the book about how there's only 3, fuel sources that could be metabolized by people with diabetes without insulin, which was fructose, fat, and alcohol. You could make the fructose, fat, and alcohol diet without insulin.
It's funny. That's what, prior to the discovery of insulin, alcohol was considered often prescribed as, part of a healthy diet for diabetes, including for children, because they could metabolize alcohol without needing insulin to do it. Sugar, fructose, always comes with glucose attached. So even though the fructose is metabolized in the gut and then in the liver, some huge proportion of it. And so you don't need insulin to metabolize it. It always comes with glucose attached, usually as sucrose or high fructose corn syrup. And then you have to deal with the insulin secretion from the glucose. And fat. One of the Well, I knew this going into the research for the book. What I didn't realize is that from 1797 is when the sort of first accepted successful treatment of a case of diabetes. So it's a British physician named John Rollo. He's got a patient. He's in the military. He's got a patient, a Colonel Meredith, who comes in having lost a lot of weight. He's hungry. He's thirsty. He's peeing. Urine is full of sugar. So Rollo decides that the therapy is that he's having trouble metabolizing carbohydrates because of the sugar in the urine, though it's just coming straight through his body, which is not that accurate. And so he figures a way to treat him is to give him a carbohydrate-free diet. And he prescribes like rancid meat and blood sausages and some green vegetables. And Rollo gets better. And then he says, okay, you don't have to eat rancid meat. You can just eat fatty meat. And Rollo ends up living for another 12 years, even though he had a pretty advanced case of diabetes when he first appears. And Meredith ends up living for another 12 years. Rollo uses the same therapy for a second patient, a general in the army, and he seems to get better, but then he decides he doesn't want to eat the diet. Dies like 3 months later. Rollo writes up these cases in a pamphlet, and he disseminates it throughout the United Kingdom. And he says, to all doctors out there, basically, if you have a case of diabetes, try this animal diet thing and see if it works and write back to me and let me know. It's like beta testing a ketogenic diet. This is how successful therapies spread through medicine back before the clinical trial era. You would try it if it worked, or if it seemed to work, you would try it on another patient. If it seemed to work on that patient, you would tell your physician buddies about it, and then they would try it. And so the physicians write back to Rollo, and these pamphlets are published, and nowadays are all available on Google Books. And they said, this thing works. If the patient follows it, they had all kinds of misconceptions. Like if they're curing diabetes, because the symptoms get better, the urine is desugarized, then why not let the patient go back to eating what they were eating before, because you cure the disease. This was sort of a common way to approach this always. And, an obvious assumption that just happened to be wrong, tragically so. But anyway, through the 19th century, this animal diet becomes a standard of care throughout the world. And again, physicians, the leading diabetes specialists in the U.S., the leading physicians in the U.S. and the U.K. and England, France, Germany, Italy, Austria are all using variations on this animal diet to treat their patients. This famous Italian physician, Cantani, is actually locking his patients away for 2 months so that they can't eat any carbohydrates. And only after they can demonstrate that they can live exclusively on fatty, mean green vegetables does he let them out. A famous French physician named Bouchardot, the ad says, look, why don't we put some butter on the broccoli, basically. Because that'll make it taste better, and it's just a fat. And by 1921, this is actually tested by 2 physicians at the University of Michigan. They published 3 articles on it in the Annals of Internal Medicine. Which happens to coexist simultaneously with the discovery of insulin. So by this point, there's a counter hypothesis and a counter theory, and some people are worried about the fat in these animal diets and the reliance of, by the late 19th century, physicians are saying the patients come in emaciated, they've lost a lot of weight, so it makes perfect sense to want to put the weight back on them. So you don't want to underfeed them. You don't want to give them too few calories, but you can't give them carbohydrates, but you can give them butter and cream, heavy cream. So let's give them as much butter and cream as we can. And for type 2 diabetes, they seem to thrive. And then by the early 1920s, there's also a Swedish physician named Petrin, who's giving his patients like 95% butter. These are patients with type 1 diabetes, and he says they do better on his effective butter fat diet than they do on insulin. And the German physician Graf, who's one of the leading metabolic disease clinicians in Germany, who's written the seminal textbook, Graf in his textbook says, I wouldn't want to live without Petrin's system, but it's hard to get anyone but Swedes to live on cucumbers and butter all day long. You don't need insulin to metabolize.
Well, to that point with, not needing insulin for it, it speaks to a ongoing debate. I even remember when I first fell into this low carb keto world and reading so much online debates about this, and which is not needing insulin to store fat. And so people would say on low carb ketogenic diets that fat is a free food. It's unlimited. You can have as much as you want because it doesn't stimulate insulin. Maybe the reason it doesn't stimulate insulin is because it doesn't actually need insulin. So wouldn't that mean fat's not a free food? Like you could just have, because presumably then you could gain weight without insulin if you just stored more and more fat. Is fat unlimited on a low carb or ketogenic diet for people?
Yeah, and the answer is I don't know. And it's probably depends on individual variation. So you do not need insulin to store fat. And again, you don't want to need insulin to store fat. But what insulin does is it inhibits the release of fat. So it's a hormone, enzyme, lipoprotein lipase, that sits on the membranes of cells, breaks down triglycerides into fatty acids so that the fatty acids can get into the cell. And that'll be a sort of passive dissemination through the membrane for the most part. Or at least so I read. You never know if these people got it right, but that's what the story is. Then there's an enzyme so that fatty acids, I describe this in detail in good calories, bad calories, why we fat. So you take this triglyceride with 3 fatty acids and a glycerol, and then lipoprotein lipase breaks it down into fatty acids. The fatty acids flow across the cell membrane, and then inside the fat cell, they're called reesterified into triglycerides. And it's kind of a fascinating system because the triglycerides are too big to get out of the fat cell. They won't pass through the membrane. I described this, back when I wrote Why We Get Fat, and I used to give lectures on this. I tell this story of when my kids were young. My wife had bought them and my oldest son, fancy IKEA bed with drawers on the bottom of it and all like this. And so I was putting this together on a Sunday in our apartment in New York, and I was watching the New York Giants on football while I built the bed in the living room. And then I tried to get it into the bedroom, and I realized the bed was too big to pass through the door.
The worst.
I had to take it apart. That's what lipoprotein lipase does, and move it through the door and put it back together again, which is basically what happens with the fat cells. And once it's in the fat cell, it's too big to get out unless you break it down into fatty acids and glycerol again. And the way you do that is with a hormone called hormone-sensitive lipase. And insulin inhibits that. And hormone-sensitive lipase is possibly the most sensitive enzyme in the body to the hormone insulin. So even at very low levels of insulin is inhibiting the enzyme you need to get fat out of your fat tissue. And again, these are things, people don't get into these kind of subtlety. I used to try and get obesity researchers. I once proposed this to a guy named Keith Frayne at the University of, I forget if it's Cambridge or Oxford. I think it was Oxford. I was in the UK and we got together for a couple of hours and we're talking about this. I said, look, Keith, leading expert in the world on fat metabolism and adipose tissue metabolism. And I said, just imagine this, create a theory of obesity from the fat cell's perspective. This is kind of getting back to Claude Bernard and the milieu of the cells and all that. Like the fat cell has no idea how much you're eating and exercising. Okay, it doesn't have any monitor for that. It is connected to the brain and the hypothalamus through the nervous system. So the nervous system can send signals to the fat cell. What those signals do is they stimulate this process of lipolysis. They basically stimulate the breaking down of triglycerides into fatty acids so they can get out of the cell. And then it sees all these things in the cell membrane, in the cell, in the intracellular fluid, the hormones like insulin and glucagon and adrenaline and growth hormone, even sex hormones that all influence fat accumulation. And it sees the amount of glucose and it sees the lipoproteins and all those things. So you can actually create a theory of obesity, of a fat cell, just based on what it sees and what could stimulate this thing to take up too much fat. But one of the driving forces is insulin inhibiting this process of lipolysis, that once it's inhibited, the fat can't get out. And that's balanced against the nervous system stimulating lipolysis. So by the mid-1960s, the leading experts on fat metabolism, who are some really smart people, are contemplating that the amount of fat you're carrying in your body is basically a balance of the action of insulin on the fat cell with the action of the nervous system on the fat cell. And if insulin's winning, you're getting fatter. And if the nervous system's winning, you're getting thinner. All of that goes away in the science of obesity with this idea that we get fat because we eat too much. And people just stop caring about, I think the way I described it in the essay was we have a science of excess fat accumulation that doesn't take into account the science of fat accumulation itself, as though these are two entirely different things. But yes, fat is free, but it's carbohydrates and the effect of insulin that pretty much determines whether that fat will stay in the fat cells or not, or whether it'll, be released, mobilized, and used for fuel. And the same hormone that determines fat storage also determine, like insulin, for instance, puts fat in fat cells and inhibits the oxidation of fat for fuel. Glucagon does the opposite, not surprisingly. So if a hormone stimulates fat storage, it's going to inhibit fat oxidation elsewhere. And the counter-regulatory hormones are going to do the opposite.
That's really fascinating. I've never thought about that, from the fat cells perspective and what they're actually seeing. So the concept of what the body sees and doesn't sees, and going back to that time question about problematic situations now versus the future. You talk in the book about how when we did start having insulin therapy for type 1 diabetics, that it now was allowing them to live long enough to the point that they would develop these other diseases, that the mechanisms of action might have been involved. You can correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but the mechanisms of action that would kill them later probably were active earlier. We just didn't see them because they weren't living long enough for these diseases to actually manifest. And now with this therapy, people are living longer, but they're dying from these, problematic conditions. Do you think the body would ever evolve to prevent those long-term disease problems that happen from basically from obesity?
I mean, that was always one of the arguments when you're discussing chronic diseases, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, for the most part, type 2 diabetes, cancer, you're discussing diseases that for the most part set in after childbearing age. So the simplest way to think about it is that they're now outside of the range that the evolution has any influence on. So yeah, but once you've had the child, as long as you're reasonably healthy, so you could raise it, there's no selective advantage anymore from evolution. So that was always seen as a rationale why talking about what our evolutionary appropriate diets might be is irrelevant, because we're talking about diseases that, set in late in life when evolution, and that's probably simplistic. And there are, theories, for instance, that societies, that evolution doesn't just have selective advantage on the individual, but it does on the group. And so a population of hunter-gatherers with healthy grandmothers are healthier than not going to have a selection evolutionary advantage over those that don't have healthy grandmothers. So the grandmothers are also going to now be folded into this umbrella of evolution. It's hard to judge, but one of the problems with all these evolutionary theories, one way or the other, is they're on some level what Kipling would have called just so stories. Why did the camel get its hump? Those kind of things. You're always guessing. You can't test the hypotheses. So there's some assumptions that seem reasonably safe that the sort of low-carb world is based on. And it's funny, the diabetes community, this was another kind of revelation in doing this research. As I said earlier, in the 19th century, up until 1914 to be specific, and in the U.S., and up until 1921 in the rest of the world, the standard of care for diabetes, the only thing that worked was this sort of animal diet of fatty meat and green vegetables. But there were people who thought that would kill patients. And the counter argument, you could find this in a half a dozen major diabetes texts, as I did, is that the Inuit and the gauchos of Argentina all subsisted on diets without carbohydrates. So they proved that humans can tolerate it. And they did it in two very different environments. And this was an argument for why patients too would be able to not just learn to love it or like it, but it wouldn't kill them prematurely because it was so new to them. And what these physicians didn't really realize, and wasn't really a major point of discussion until the mid-20th century, was that other things that were new to modern diets were refined grains and sugars, and, I'll throw seed oils in, even though I don't particularly buy that thinking. And so these new foods, and this was something you could assume is likely to be true, something that's completely new to the environment that we didn't evolve to consume or to do, is likely to do us harm because our bodies haven't had time to adapt to it.
Something else I wonder, this is super random and out there, but I thought about it while reading your book and I'm thinking about it now. I wonder if, speaking to this evolutionary framework of certain diseases that happen pre-reproductive years and then these other diseases that manifest afterwards, because again, maybe it's oversimplified, but presumably because the body is doing mechanisms to preserve the body up until reproductive years. I wonder if, because we see with like super centenarians that they tend to be pretty healthy up until this certain age and then they just die. So it seems like there's some sort of limit. Maybe it's like the Hayflick limit or who knows what it is. But it makes me wonder if, say we crack that code and we, can unlock the possibility to live past this glass ceiling that we seemingly have on our longevity. I wonder if there'll be a new bracket of diseases that we won't realize once we pass that glass ceiling.
Yeah, hard to imagine that, just because, well, again, it's not on one level. As things break down, one of the joys of getting older is you realize that things just break. They break on old cars and they break on old people. And if they're external, if they're bones and the like, you can get them fixed. If they're organs, it's a lot more difficult. So I suppose that as, more and more people live into their hundreds, they'll find unique ways to break that didn't happen before. But it's interesting. Even one of the last magazine articles I wrote before I started doing almost exclusively books was on longevity for Discover magazine. And I was interviewing the guys who run these centenarian projects where they study centenarians to see what they do that might explain their longevity. And the answer I was getting, at least circa 2008 or so, was that the one thing they had in common was that they had relatives who had also lived, well into their 90s. And so this clearly seemed to be protective genes, or not necessarily. Some of them smoked, they ate terrible diets, all of that was kind of irrelevant. What they needed to live that long was to come from a family that lived that long. And then they had a good shot at it. Now, I suppose that means you could identify the genes at some point that made them unique. I remember, interestingly enough, one New York researcher said in his cohort that they all seem to have very high levels of HDL. Cholesterol was one of the few things that stood out, which would be the kind of thing you could get if you eat a very low carb diet. That'll boost your HDL significantly. So maybe there's a relationship, but it's all sort of speculation. My general issue with longevity science is that your hypothesis is, if I do X, Y, and Z, I will live longer. And in order to test that hypothesis, you have to do the experiments pretty much for life. Like mortality has to be your endpoint. And that research, I mean, we do it in mice, but we never know if what mice do has any can be extrapolated to humans. So it's sort of, you have a entire burgeoning science that's pretty much outside the realm of science itself because the hypotheses can't be tested. And you just never know. Like the idea, I mean, we've all gotten used to metformin being this very benign drug, right? That increases, that makes you more insulin sensitive, which would seemingly have to be a good thing. But our 100 or going on 100 years of experience with metformin has all been in people who eat, for the most part, standard American or French diets with a lot of carbohydrates in them. So you have no real idea what it would do to someone who, like me, lives on doesn't eat starches and sweets and grains and legumes, and so burns fat instead of glucose for fuel. Maybe it's not benign for that metabolism, and you really have no idea. So there's an awful lot of guesswork that goes on that ideally we would avoid.
I get really haunted, especially when I read books like yours, when it's just so saturated in history. I think the thing that stresses me out personally the most is looking back on these historical accounts and what they thought and how certain they might have been. Well, two things. Either how certain they were about things that now we know is incorrect, and also things they just didn't think about because they didn't know they needed to think about it. You mentioned somewhere in the book how people weren't even really contemplating the mechanisms of fat storage because people weren't really, like, they didn't have the obesity epidemic. People weren't really getting fat. And it's kind of like, I read a book about the history of fasting and I had the guest on the show, and he talked about how for the longest time people didn't, like when people lost weight, it wasn't evident or obvious to them that it was from eating less because because they just didn't know. And so it makes me wonder now, and I guess not eating less because we have the whole debate about the hormones and everything, but basically less calories being put into the body than taken out. Makes me wonder now, things we don't know because we just don't know to think about them. Or maybe like you were mentioning earlier, we're at this point with AI and all this information that maybe there aren't that many things left that we just don't know, that we're not thinking about.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm trying to write an essay. It's in like version 43 at this point for The Atlantic on whether or not the insulin story, and the possibility that the insulin story is a cautionary tale for the GLP-1 agonist explosion.
Wouldn't you talk about this? Okay.
I keep thinking, maybe I'm just, okay, I'm not a doctor. I'm not, my brain does some things pretty good, well, and other things not well at all. And some things it used to do well. I clearly had too many concussions as a youth, and it doesn't do it all anymore. So the insulin story, basically, which we started to touch on, is you have this drug that is, miracle drug for kids with type 1 diabetes. And because they really are not differentiating enough between type 1 and type 2 diabetes, it ends up being therapy pretty much for everyone who's got diabetes, even the ones who can clearly control it with diet. And because, especially with children back then, and still true today, is diagnosis of diabetes was kind of a tragic thing. You didn't want to make the kid's life any worse by telling them that he or she now had to eat entirely differently than the other kids, that they could never have chocolate cake ever again or a Coca-Cola ever again. So as time went on, the idea was, just let the kids eat carbohydrates. Then it was let the adults eat carbohydrates. Let's just give them enough insulin to cover it. And if that means a lot more insulin, then we'll give them a lot more insulin. And if they start to get fatter, well, we'll give them the insulin, but we'll tell them to watch their calories and exercise. And by the 1930s, as you mentioned, you suddenly start to see this tidal wave of diabetic complications in these patients. So, atherosclerosis, arteriosclerosis, sclerotic plaques throughout the arteries of the body, heart disease, strokes, the hypertension, kidney failure, retinopathies, and so they're going blind, neuropathies, nerve failure, they're having, lower limbs amputated, and these patients who were maybe diagnosed when they were 10 years old, diabetes, and saved from death when they were 12 years old by insulin, like this miracle, now are maybe 27, 30, 35, and they go from being healthy to dead in the course of a year or two. And the diabetes community doesn't know what to make of it. And they assume that the problem is poor blood sugar control and not rigorous enough use of insulin therapy. But the only thing they know at this point in time is that the disease is that the kids with the severe diabetes weren't living long enough to see, as you had mentioned earlier, weren't living long enough to see to see whether or not they got these complications just from the disease. And now that you're treating it with insulin therapy and you're letting them eat carbohydrates, which you didn't let them do prior to insulin therapy, all you could say is that this tidal wave of complications associates with having the disease for 10, 12, 15 years and using insulin therapy to treat it, and the dietary philosophy, this liberal carbohydrate diet that we're allowing these patients to eat, and we're allowing them to cover it with insulin. And any one of those or all three of them could be causing the complications, but they have no way to tell. There's just no way to determine. They believe so strongly in insulin therapy, they just sort of reject any possibility that it could be that. And yet it clearly could be. And today that question is unsettled, a century after insulin therapy. It could clearly be the diet. So if they never let them eat carbs and minimize drug use, insulin therapy, which is basically what Richard Bernstein began advocating of, Bernstein's diabetes solution, 1980s. If they just do that, they seem to thrive. So it could really be the diet, and they just couldn't tell. Nobody could tell. And so, again, this is the philosophy that carries forward ever since. But one of the issues in trying to figure this out for the sort of present and the future, you mentioned the certainty with which people say things, in interviews. And then the only thing I know for certain is how little people know. So the likelihood that they still know very little. And with GLP-1 agonists, getting back to the story I'm trying to write for The Atlantic, it's clearly in its own way a miracle drug. I mean, people who struggle with obesity their whole life, for whom it's an intractable disorder, can suddenly lose a significant portion of their excess weight. That's a wonderful thing. And for adolescents and childhood, just as type 1 diabetes was, a terrible disease and fatal, obesity in childhood and adolescence can be a pretty terrible disease too, even if it's, just a chronic disorder, not by no means fatal. And so you've got this wonder drug and you see people embracing it, and suddenly diet becomes secondary or tertiary. Now we can really pay lip service to diet because we got a drug. And you could easily see a situation 20 years from now where we've completely misunderstood the cause of obesity and how to prevent it and how to treat it because of the introduction of such a successful drug. And you could also see a situation where just as many of the complications of living with diabetes for years to decades could be caused by the insulin therapy, it's quite possible that over years or decades of use of GLP-1s, and the younger you are when you start, the longer you'll have for this to happen, could be caused by the drugs or exacerbated by the drugs. And it'll be very hard to tell. It'll be hard even to do an observational study because the people you would have to compare with, your controls, would be patients who never went on the drugs and maybe never lost any weight. And so also died prematurely, but just from the complications of the condition, not of the complications of the condition and the therapy. and the therapy in the absence of any dietary therapy. So there are a lot of real parallels that are a little bit scary, while simultaneously recognizing that these drugs are fairly remarkable. And, I can understand the appeal.
Sounds like the beginning. It's either the beginning of a horror movie or of I don't know, like Lord of the Rings, like a like a victory.
And no, it's funny. I say that in the article where to one point, talking about, again, the long-term, what happens. So we study, the pharmaceutical company, the obesity researchers have studied what happens if you go off these medications after a year or two. But what happens if you are on them for 20 years and have to discontinue? And can you discontinue? So let's say after 20 years, your body is habituated to the drugs. They're no longer really working. You've gained the weight back anyway. And now you are having side effects that make them intolerable, but maybe you try to get off and the side effects get worse, not better. And this is a pattern that happens with existing drugs, benzodiazepines.
Like this is everywhere, this pattern.
And I think in the article, it was this, I say, we have no idea what will happen when people try to do this, but at the risk of sounding ominous, we will find out.
What do you think is the role of science and medicine making those judgment calls? Because you were talking about how with the kids on the insulin that basically it was that it would be too difficult for these kids not to eat the carbs, so we'll just cover it with the insulin. There seems to be this idea, and you talk about it a lot in the book, basically weighing the potential physical issues of disease or future disease with the psychological or the stress burden of sticking to a diet that might be, seemingly difficult to stick to.
So that's what, you could run a thought experiment. So let's assume that what Bernstein has observed with himself. So Richard Bernstein, diagnosed with diabetes at 1946 at age 12. By 1970, he's got a degree from Columbia University in physics. He's working as an engineer. He's doing the best he can to keep his diabetes under control, and yet the complications are setting in. He's got all kinds of problems, including hypoglycemia that sends him to the hospital roughly once a month. And he decides he's got to do something about it. And he becomes the first person ever to buy a device that allows him to measure his own blood sugar at home. Literally patient number one to do this. And over the course of about 3 years, he does a series. He's got an engineer's mind, so he does a series of studies, and he realizes that he can essentially keep normal blood sugar, like the blood sugar of a healthy human being, a healthy non-diabetic, if he avoids carbohydrates entirely, and then he can use very low doses of insulin because of the law of small numbers. So, no carbs, low doses, that minimizes the mistakes. It minimizes the variations. It minimizes the response of your body to what you're putting in it and what you're injecting into it. And to make a long story short, he motivates the medical community to study it. He prompts the use basically of home glucose monitoring. He gets as much credit as any human being alive should. And then he writes books, goes back to med school in his 40s, the oldest medical student ever at Einstein, and gets his recommendations written by the leading diabetes specialists of that era, of the 1970s, and he writes his books, and he becomes a doctor and treats diabetes. And he's still alive. I think he's turning 90 in May, and he's still practicing.
Did you interview him?
Yes. We spend holidays with my in-laws about 10 miles from where he lives in Westchester County. So I spent about 6 hours with Richard Bernstein. Didn't mean, by the way, he's a cantankerous guy. I have no idea if he liked my book. No, I basically say, give him complete credit for catalyzing a revolution in diabetes therapy that, in other worlds would have won. If he had been a physician, it would have won him a Nobel Prize, or an academic researcher. Anyway, if that's true, so let's say if in 1921, and when insulin's discovered, if these people, and the leading diabetes specialist at the time, a guy named Elliot Jocelyn, who had his clinic in Boston. He had the first dedicated diabetes clinic in the United States, and that became eventually the Joslin Diabetes Center, which is associated with Harvard. Joslin argued at the time for very low doses of insulin and a very restricted diet as the safest way to approach using this drug, but he was pretty much eventually just outvoted by people who said, look, patients aren't going to stay on a diet anyway. And then, like I said, by the 1930s, you have this tidal wave of complications. Imagine if in 1921 they said, look, you could do this, Bernstein's protocol. So you're not going to eat grains and starches and rices anymore, but we're going to minimize your doses of insulin. And, Bernstein never really got into ketogenic diets because he kind of believed the saturated fat story when he was doing this. It was so well accepted. But, you could eat a high fat, pretty high calorie diet. Just don't eat these foods and you'll be healthy. Or you could do what we are going to do. In 15, 20 years from now, you're going to suffer this tidal wave of diabetic complications and go blind and have amputations and die. It sounds like a crazy way to describe it, but that appears 100 years later to be a valid description of the options. And now, of course, we have much better drug therapy and much better drug delivery devices like insulin pumps. We have them, so you can delay all those complications. Instead of 10 or 15 years, you can now probably go out 40 years. But people, if you do the opposite, with type 1, Bernstein's method, and type 2 is effectively a ketogenic diet, this animal diet circa 2024, it looks like it could put the disease kind of into remission and not suffer the symptoms. I mean, even Bernstein, he's alive at 90. He spent the first 18 years with the disease pretty much uncontrolled. So a lot of the damage he suffered, a lot of his issues might have been kicked off by the poor control in the first 18 years. They didn't know enough to think like that or to do that. And today, when they should, it's hard to renounce all those belief systems and step outside of it. That's why you need somebody like a journalist like me who's outside the system, because I could come along and say, look, I'm not wedded to anything you've done so far. I just want to find out why we have such, why in 2024, 40 million Americans have diabetes as opposed to like 1 million, 1.5 million in 1960. And why it's still considered a chronic progressive disease and multiple drug therapy is the norm and people have to deal with the complications of these drugs. That doesn't have to be the case. The evidence today is this does not have to be a chronic progressive disease, that this disease can be put in remission by diet. So shouldn't physicians and patients know that and advocate for it? Say to their patients when diagnosed, look, you could do it this way. You could pull the diet lever and you won't even really know you have the disease, but you're not going to eat a donut again or drink a Coca-Cola or eat pasta, okay? Or you could do the drug thing and then you could have all the donuts and Coca-Cola you want. Well, not all of it, moderation. And you'll get fatter and you'll get, GLP-1s will solve the getting fatter problem, but you see the point. There's sort of two ways to look at it. The traditional way where we know it's a chronic progressive disease and the dietary way where it does not appear to be and where you can put the disease into remission. Can we offer that as a viable possibility?
Maybe a marriage of the two ideas would be if the system could prescribe a pill, that the pill, it would just be a sugar. Well, no, it would not be a sugar pill. It would be a pill. I don't know what would be in it. Something completely benign. And it would have a lot of instructions like, you take this pill, but this pill cannot be taken with sugar or carbs, or like turn it into a pill system, but you have to make dietary changes to take the pill.
Well, it's funny because the GLP-1 agonists, so Wegovy and Ozempic and all those may do that to some extent. People talk about their appetites completely inhibited, but I haven't heard yet, like for what? Like for sweets? For for prime rib, is it macronutrient specific, or is it all foods? The other thing, I once was approached by a Wall Street guy who had developed a pill that you suck on. It dissolves, and then for the next 2 hours, carbohydrates don't taste good and sugar tastes off for you. So as a sort of something you could take before eating to target your carbohydrate consumption. And it worked. But what I noticed was I had to make the conscious effort to do it before eating. And I didn't want to do that if I knew I was going to have something sweet or wanted to have something sweet. It's like I didn't want to shut that off. Yeah, I might end up with a sort of more primitive perspective, which would look, if we just... Actually, let me tell you one other anecdote, which is one way to think about this. And this was told to me by, and it's in the book in the epilogue, a chef turned journalist who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in his 30s. This was back in 2016. And when you're diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, you're, in effect, dropped into disease land. Like, here's a disease you may never have thought about before unless one of your relatives or friends has it. And suddenly you're told you have it and it's a serious disease. You have to learn as much about it as you can in a very short period of time. And your physicians and your diabetes educator, maybe your endocrinologist, are going to do their best before they even let you leave the hospital to teach you how to inject insulin and, what it feels like to have a hypoglycemic episode and how to deal with that with the necessary sugar pills or whatever. And so the doctor was explaining to this young man, what young by my standards, that he now has a disease in which he can no longer tolerate the carbohydrate content of the diet. He can't metabolize them safely. And the reason is his pancreas is no longer secreting enough insulin to do that. So they're going to give him insulin, and then they're going to have him eat a set amount of carbohydrates at every meal for the insulin to cover. And he says to the doctor, so wait a minute, let me get this straight. What you're telling me is carbohydrates are now poison to me, and insulin is the antidote. And I should eat the poison and take the antidote. And in fact, eat enough of the poison to make sure the antidote doesn't kill me. Why don't I just not eat the poison? I don't need the antidote. And it's like the doctor was mystified by this logic because he'd never really thought about it before. And the doctor assumed that he would never be able to stick to a diet. And, because it's basically, if I'm not eating the carbs, that's it, for all intents and purposes, ketogenic diet, and we know that nobody sticks to it. And this guy actually says to his doctor, I don't understand. If you want me to exercise, if I said I'm going to go work out 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, you wouldn't tell me, well, no one complies with that kind of exercise program. You would say, bravo, go for it. But if I tell you I'm just not going to eat carbohydrates, now you're going to tell me I can't do it in advance? Why not let me try? So it's sort of the medical community, and this I've described in my other books, they created all these thought processes. They missed these very obvious ways to deal with these diseases. You can't metabolize carbohydrates safely. Don't eat them. You don't need them. We don't have any physiological requirement for carbohydrates like we do for fats and protein. We know, as the 19th century doctor said, from the Inuit and the gauchos of Argentina, that you can thrive without these foods in your diet. So just don't eat them, and then we can minimize your drug use. If you have type 2, you probably won't need any drugs at all. If you have type 1, we'll minimize your insulin, which will minimize swings in your blood sugar, which will keep your blood sugar stable, which is the goal. And they just had all these excuses, rationales that they had developed in their misconceptions over the years so that they wouldn't take seriously the most obvious approach to treating this disease in a way that would keep the patient the healthiest, even if it meant the patient had to make some sacrifices, which they would anyway. These would just be sacrifices that actually work.
So crazy. And not to keep on with the dark train of it all, but it's really interesting with something like cancer, for example. and chemotherapy, which has is miserable to go through and a lot of terrible side effects, but they don't make that judgment call there. Like they don't say chemotherapy is too hard for you, so we're not going to offer it. I find it really interesting, like where they make the judgment calls about what we as humans can and cannot do.
But funny, I used that exact same metaphor just last week. So a very good friend of mine was diagnosed with Parkinson's. So she's 68 and her husband is a very good friend of mine. I was talking to him about it and I said, there's some anecdotal evidence that ketogenic diets can inhibit the progression of Parkinson's and maybe, at some level help minimize symptoms. And they say, yeah, but that's a lot of trouble. And, my wife she really likes her carbs and her wine. And I said, look, if she was diagnosed with cancer, right, and doctor said we're going to be on a chemotherapy program for the next 6 months, she's going to feel, you wouldn't say, well, she's going to feel miserable, I'm not going to do it. You would say, okay, you're going to feel miserable. You're going to have to do it anyway. And hopefully at the end of 6 months, we'll have solved much of the problem with disease. And then you'll feel a lot better and we'll go from there. So why not think the same way about ketogenic diet? First of all, I don't think she'll be miserable, even if she misses her wine and her pasta. But give it 4 months. Do it right and see if she feels better. And treat it like chemotherapy. It's like, look, we're just going to do this. We're going to show up every meal. Let's see if you feel better. And if you do, then after the end of 4 months, you'll know what you're balancing, what the trade-off is. Is it really worth eating my pasta and my donuts and having my wine and suffering this slow progression of this disease into, premature death? Or do I like being healthy, relatively healthy, more than I like eating a donut? So, we'll see how that goes.
So crazy. This has been beyond amazing, listeners. And we didn't even remotely touch on, there's just so much in your book. I just can't even, there's so many little things. Like we didn't talk about like how they use insulin to treat schizophrenia, which was pretty mind blowing, or like all these other different options that tried and actually did sort of work that weren't low carb, like the oatmeal diet or the sugar cure. Basically, there's a lot of really interesting things in this book. I highly recommend everybody get it now. Rethinking Diabetes. Thank you so much, Gary. And you were saying earlier that you don't know if you were causing the wave or riding the wave with, your initial work. And I would definitely vote for, even if the waves were already there, like you definitely catalyzed everything and created the tidal waves with all of the work that you were doing. And I just can't thank you enough. And I can't wait for your next, maybe last book. Do you anticipate when that will be coming out?
I would have said, say maybe January 2026. But I put things on hold for a while to work on this Substack, Nina Teicholz. So we're doing a Substack together called Unsettled Science. Regular articles and essays and criticisms of the work coming out in nutrition and chronic disease science. And so I'm trying to get that up and going. Nina and I see it as we're kind of in startup mode. So we have to work on that too much to get to the point that it's actually generating an income. We could cut back and go to the other things that interest us in life. So my obesity book might be delayed by about 6 months. It's basically it'll be like Rethinking Diabetes in that it's going to be a history of the science of obesity, which has never really been written. And again, it's on some level, I discuss this in every one of my books, but this idea that obesity it's a fat storage disorder. It's not an energy balance disorder. It's not about eating too much, and how that theory arose and why it arose and what happened to it. And when I first started writing about this for Good Calories, Bad Calories, I had maybe, there's a lot of German and Austrian writing. They were doing the major research on the fat storage and on fat tissue and obesity up until the Second World War. And I had only the stuff that was translated into English. Now I could get all the original No, not all, but most, they say 80% of the original documents, and can get them translated by AI programs. It's just opened up a whole new world of fascinating, really smart people talking about the same subjects that are controversial today. And on one level, I can't wait to write it and do it. And on the other, it's like, I've got to get the Substack going. So trade-off.
That explains why. Okay, so because I went to your Substack, because once I had Nina on the show, I immediately subscribed to her Substack. So then I went to your link for the Substack and it pulled up Nina's, and I was like, wait, where's Gary's? Okay, that makes sense now. Okay, I got it.
Yeah, well, in theory, it's both of ours. We're still working on, because it was Nina's first and I joined her, there are still ways, like if you Google Unsettled Science, it'll say Unsettled Science, Nina Teicholz, Substack. It's both of us, and we're still trying to figure out all the ways to sort of have it, make it clear that it's both of us.
Did I tell you when I first wrote my book with a traditional publisher for stores what they said about you?
And no, you didn't, but...
Okay. So, because I originally self-published my book, and then I got my agent, and we were rewriting the book to publish, and the legal department, was it the legal department or the editor? I guess it was the editor. They actually didn't have that many comments about things they wanted me to change. There was a big red sticker on your name because I had talked all about what I learned from your book. And they were like, you have to put some sort of disclaimer here about him. I was like, what? And they were like, yeah. So I went in, I'll have to show you what I ended up writing, but I put something that I was happy about. I basically put in a disclaimer sentence about how your work was debated among people. And then I just kept everything I said originally. But I thought that was really funny.
It's funny. I was one of the Substacks I recently wrote. And the way we've been doing it is one of us will write it and the other one will edit it. I had said that there was a meeting in Copenhagen. Novo Nordisk, the company that makes the GLP-1 agonists, their foundation had invite-only meeting of expert obesity researchers. And I put the word expert in parentheses, in quotation marks, and then I had a parenthetical saying I put experts in quotation marks because I was included in the group. And I was, basically Nina was like, this is crazy fake humility, Gary. It's like, of course you're an expert. And it's like, well, maybe an expert to us, but 95% of the relevant medical community thinks we are wrong, and I am not an expert to them. And I would like to acknowledge that. I think we took it out, but it's sort of, I might have, it's the problem with, and I do want to write a Substack about this, just challenging the conventional wisdom. Often when people report about my work, the way they'll do it is they'll interview me, and then they'll find 3 people who have never read my books, but have prestigious appointments who will explain why I'm a quack. And I always want to say to them, people who haven't read my work, saying I'm a quack is meaningless, because I'm challenging their work, they have to think I'm a quack. They have to think I'm wrong, because I'm saying, look, this journalist thinks he knows better than you do. What you should find, and I could give you the names, are the people who have these respected, impressive appointments who have read my book and think I'm likely right. They're the meaningful ones because they actually went through the trouble to try and assess my arguments, not the ones who just know I'm wrong because I disagree with them. That's crazy.
I know you have to go. The last question I usually ask is just what's something that you're grateful for so we can end on a happy note.
Everything. My oldest son got into a good college, which means we haven't screwed up his parents yet, or at least not noticeably.
Well, thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Melanie. This was really, I had a lot of fun, so thanks.
Awesome. I did too. Have a good evening.
Okay, you too. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the Melanie Avalon Biohacking Podcast. For more information, you can check out my book, What When Wine? Lose weight and feel great with paleo-style meals, intermittent fasting, and wine, as well as my blog, melanieavalon.com. Feel free to contact me at podcast@melanieavalon.com. And always remember, you got this.